There is a truth about love that almost no one wants to admit because once you see it, you can never return to the innocent version of yourself again. Most people think the greatest betrayal is discovering that someone stopped loving them. It isn't. The greatest betrayal is realizing they never loved you in the way you believed they did. They loved what happened inside them when you were there. They loved the comfort, the certainty, the attention, the escape from loneliness, the feeling of being chosen. But you were simply the container holding all of those feelings together. And the moment those feelings could exist without you, or with someone else, the story changed. The terrifying part is that they never had to lie with words. They only had to let you believe the illusion. That's why this kind of heartbreak feels impossible to explain. You weren't abandoned overnight. You slowly discovered that the relationship you were mourning had never existed in the way you remembered it. At first, everything felt too perfect to question. Their interest arrived with unusual intensity. They wanted your time, your attention, your presence. They studied your habits, remembered your stories, laughed at things no one else noticed. It felt rare because it felt personal. You assumed someone could only notice you that deeply if they genuinely cared. But human beings are naturally observant when they're chasing something that fulfills a need. Curiosity is often mistaken for love. Intensity is often mistaken for commitment. Someone trying to fill an emotional emptiness can appear more devoted than someone genuinely in love because need creates urgency, while real love creates patience. You confused urgency with depth, and by the time the urgency disappeared, you were already emotionally invested. One of the cruelest psychological traps is that people often treat you best before they know whether they'll keep you. During uncertainty, your value is high because your presence isn't guaranteed. Every conversation matters. Every moment feels important. Every detail becomes worth remembering. But certainty changes human behavior. Once they become convinced you aren't leaving, the emotional effort that once felt effortless quietly begins to disappear. Not because they consciously decided to become different, but because uncertainty had been fueling their attention all along. You believed you were watching love become comfortable. In reality, you were watching desire lose its reason to perform. That's why the transition feels so confusing. There isn't a dramatic turning point. There isn't a single conversation where everything collapses. Instead, you begin noticing tiny absences. The excitement fades first. Then the curiosity. Then the emotional presence. They're physically there, but psychologically somewhere else. They still say enough to keep the relationship alive, but never enough to make it feel alive. You begin chasing the version of them that existed in the beginning, believing you've somehow done something wrong. What you don't realize is that you're competing against a version of them that was never sustainable because it wasn't built on love. It was built on pursuit. People rarely pretend because they wake up wanting to deceive someone. Most pretending begins with self-deception. They genuinely believe what they're feeling is love because it feels powerful. Their heart races. They think about you constantly. They miss you when you're gone. They crave your attention. But craving isn't always love. Addiction and attachment can imitate love almost perfectly. The difference only appears over time. Love becomes steadier as familiarity grows. Emotional dependency becomes weaker because it was feeding on novelty, uncertainty, or validation rather than genuine connection. They weren't pretending on purpose. They simply mistook emotional hunger for emotional commitment. This explains why they changed without being able to explain why they changed. If you had asked them during the beginning whether they loved you, they probably would have said yes without hesitation. They weren't acting. They were experiencing something real. The problem was that the feeling they called love depended on conditions they couldn't recognize. Once those conditions disappeared, so did the emotion they believed would last forever. They looked at you expecting to feel what they once felt, and when they didn't, they assumed something inside the relationship had broken. In reality, The relationship hadn't changed nearly as much as the emotional engine driving it had simply run out of fuel. Meanwhile, you stayed consistent. You loved through familiarity instead of excitement. You loved through routine instead of adrenaline. Ironically, this made your love grow stronger at exactly the same moment theirs began fading. That's why the emotional distance became unbearable. While they were slowly detaching, you were becoming more attached because stability increased your sense of safety. Both of you believed you were reacting normally, yet your emotional directions were moving farther apart every day. You were walking toward each other emotionally at different speeds, until eventually you realized you were walking alone. One question haunts almost everyone after this kind of relationship. Was any of it real? The answer is more painful than either yes or no. The emotions were real. The interpretation wasn't. They really enjoyed your presence. They really felt relief when you were around. They really believed they needed you. But those emotions belonged to what you gave them, not necessarily to who you were. Imagine confusing the warmth of sunlight with love for the window it shines through. The window isn't creating the warmth. It's simply where the warmth appears. That's how some people experience relationships. They become attached to the feeling they receive while believing they're attached to the person providing it. Eventually, they begin searching for that feeling again. This is why people sometimes seem capable of replacing someone so quickly. They aren't replacing a person as much as they're replacing an emotional experience. The details change. The face changes. The memories change. But the psychological pattern remains almost identical. They pursue intensity. They feel complete. Certainty arrives. Excitement fades. Restlessness returns. They call it bad luck in love, never realizing they're chasing emotions that naturally expire. You weren't the exception to the cycle because the cycle was never about you in the first place. The hardest part is what happens inside the person who genuinely loved. You begin questioning your memory. Maybe you imagined the affection. Maybe you expected too much. Maybe you became difficult. Maybe you weren't attractive enough, interesting enough, exciting enough. Slowly, the mind rewrites history in order to avoid accepting a terrifying possibility that someone can make you feel deeply loved without possessing a love capable of surviving reality. Your brain would rather blame you than accept that contradiction because self-blame creates the illusion of control. If it was your fault, then perhaps next time you can prevent it. Accepting the truth means accepting that another person's emotional limitations were never yours to solve. Looking back, you begin noticing moments that once seemed insignificant. They admired how available you were but rarely became curious about the parts of you that couldn't benefit them. They enjoyed your reassurance more than your honesty. They appreciated your loyalty more than your individuality. Whenever you became complicated, emotional, uncertain, or difficult to understand, their patience quietly disappeared. They loved the version of you that protected their comfort, not the complete human being standing in front of them. Genuine love grows more curious during complexity. Conditional attachment grows more distant because complexity interrupts convenience. Perhaps that's why you still miss them long after they're gone. You're not only grieving a person. You're grieving the identity you believed existed inside their eyes. Every time they smiled at you, you believed you were seeing your worth reflected back. Every promise became evidence that you mattered. Every affectionate gesture became proof that you'd finally found someone who truly saw you. When they left, or emotionally disappeared, that reflection shattered. Suddenly, you weren't only asking where they went. You were asking where the version of yourself they created had gone. Losing that illusion feels like losing yourself because so much of your identity had quietly attached itself to the way they perceived you. The strange thing about pretending is that it leaves behind memories that feel authentic. That's why healing becomes so difficult. Every vacation, every conversation, every laugh, Every quiet moment seems to argue against the painful conclusion you've reached. Your heart keeps presenting evidence that they loved you because your memories are emotionally real. But memories only capture behavior. They don't reveal motivation. Two identical actions can come from completely different emotional worlds. Someone can hold your hand because they deeply cherish you. Someone else can hold your hand because they're terrified of being alone. From the outside, both moments look identical. Only time reveals which one was true. Eventually, a realization arrives that changes everything. They didn't pretend to love you because you were unlovable. They pretended because the version of love they understood depended on what you could temporarily provide. When those needs changed, their feelings changed with them. It wasn't calculated cruelty as much as emotional immaturity hidden behind convincing affection. Unfortunately, emotional immaturity often feels exactly like passion during the beginning, which is why so many people mistake the brightest flames for the strongest fire. One day you'll remember how desperately you searched for the exact moment everything fell apart. You'll replay conversations, expressions, quiet evenings, ordinary mornings, trying to discover the invisible fracture that destroyed the relationship. But perhaps there was never a single fracture. Perhaps the ending was already quietly present inside the beginning. Perhaps the relationship was always moving toward the moment when performance would no longer be necessary, when emotional hunger would no longer disguise itself as devotion, when certainty would finally expose what uncertainty had been hiding all along. That is the haunting truth almost no one wants to confront. Sometimes they didn't stop loving you. Sometimes they reached the end of a feeling they had mistaken for love from the very beginning. And while you spent months trying to understand why they became someone different, they were unknowingly becoming who they had always been. The tragedy wasn't that they fooled you. The tragedy was that they fooled themselves first. And by the time reality finally arrived, you were the one left mourning a love that only ever existed as long as it was needed.